Chicago drive-by nightmare. Innocent lives lost in a deadly shooting. The first bullet shattered the silence before anyone in the parking lot even knew what was happening. It came fast, sharp, and loud, ripping through the warm Chicago afternoon like a lightning strike. People screamed, cars lurched forward, and inside a silver Infiniti sitting in the McDonald's drive-thru lane, a 7-year-old girl named Jaslyn Adams didn't even have time to react before the world around her exploded into chaos. Her father, John Tay, shouted her name as the gunfire rained down on them. Windows burst inwards, glass scattered everywhere. More bullets followed, dozens of them, each one hitting with deadly force. The shooters didn't stop, didn't hesitate, didn't care who was inside the car. Their only goal was to send a message, and that message came through loud and clear. Customers ducked under their seats. Workers dropped to the floor. A woman in the next car covered her child's head and prayed it would end. But for Jaslyn, sitting in the back seat with her seatbelt still buckled, the nightmare had already begun. Her bright smile, her pink jacket, her little legs swinging moments earlier, everything was now covered in shattered glass and rising smoke. And then, as quickly as it started, the rain of bullets stopped. Her father stumbled out of the driver's side, collapsing to the ground as he cried for help. He tried pulling open the back door, his hand shaking, his voice breaking. He shouted for someone, anyone, to call 911. A stranger ran to them, another pressed on the wounds. Others screamed for ambulances that felt like they were taking forever. In the middle of the chaos, the small body of a little girl lay still. By the time the sirens echoed through the McDonald's parking lot, Jaslyn's fate had already been sealed. But the story of how this quiet father-daughter outing turned into one of Chicago's most heartbreaking drive-by tragedies didn't begin with the sound of gunfire. It started long before the shooters pulled up beside them. It started before the bright afternoon sun, before the drive-thru line, before Jaslyn begged her dad for her favorite meal. But Chicago's gang tensions were changing. Lines had been crossed. Retaliations were being planned. Messages were being delivered, not through conversations or warnings, but through bullets. And unknown to Jaslyn and her father, they were driving through a neighborhood where anger was building like a storm. Someone had been marked, someone had been followed, someone had been targeted. But no one expected a child to pay the price. That morning, two men got into a car miles away from the McDonald's parking lot. They had a mission, and they had been planning it. For them, this was another day on streets where violence felt normal. They didn't talk about fear. They didn't talk about guilt. They only talked about getting the job done. They had no idea the small body they would hit later belonged to a little girl who loved TikTok dances, school snacks, and cuddling for stuffed animals before bed. By early afternoon, Jaslyn and her father pulled into the drive-thru, laughing about the order, talking about what they would do later. It was calm, it was simple, it was safe, or so they thought. Across the parking lot, another car rolled in. Slowly, quietly. The men inside watched. They waited. They followed the silver Infiniti through the line. In their eyes, this was where the message would be delivered. They didn't see a child in the back seat. They didn't care to look. And then the driver lowered his window. Witnesses later said they didn't even see the gun come out. All they saw was the sudden burst of muzzle flashes, bright, fast, and deadly. The first bullets tore through the car. The last ones hit the pavement. What the shooters didn't know was who they truly hit. What they didn't expect was the explosion of outrage that would hit Chicago within hours. And what they never imagined was how fast detectives would begin piecing together the truth. The chapter of violence they opened in that parking lot was far from over. Because the moment the ambulance pulled away, with lights flashing and Jaslyn inside, Chicago made a promise. Someone would answer for what happened to this innocent child. And the men who fired those shots had no idea how close the city already was to finding them. The streets of Chicago felt heavy the next morning. News stations repeated the same heartbreaking headline over and over. A 7-year-old girl killed in a drive-by shooting at a McDonald's drive-thru. Photos of Jaslyn, smiling brightly with her hair in little bows, appeared on every screen. People across the city cried, argued, demanded answers.
Mothers held their children tighter. Fathers stared at the floor in anger and disbelief. Everyone wanted to know one thing: who would kill a child? Detectives were already working before sunrise. They didn't sleep. They didn't take breaks. From the moment the ambulances left the parking lot, the Chicago Police Department knew this case would explode. When a grown man was killed in a drive-by, people paid attention. But when a child died, especially one as young and innocent as Jaslyn, the whole nation watched. And that pressure lit a fire under every investigator on the case. Detective Ramirez was one of the first on the scene. He looked at the bullet holes across the silver infinity. Too many, way too many. Whoever did this didn't fire to scare, they fired to kill. He noticed the direction of the shots, the angle, the shattered glass pattern. He noticed how the shooters must have slowed down just enough to make sure every bullet hit the car. He knew something else, too. This wasn't random. The father, John Tay, sat inside the hospital hallway, shaking uncontrollably. Doctors were treating his own wounds, but none of that mattered to him. His hands were still stained with glass. His shirt was soaked in tears. He kept repeating the same words. "She didn't deserve this. My baby didn't deserve this." Detectives approached him slowly, knowing they needed answers, but also knowing he was a broken man. They asked him the hard question, the question no grieving parent ever wants to hear. "Do you know who might have been after you?" At first, he couldn't speak. Then he nodded. He wasn't part of a gang, but he knew people who were. Chicago neighborhoods ran on lines, territories, arguments, grudges that went back years. Sometimes you didn't have to be involved at all. Sometimes just knowing the wrong person was enough to put a target on your back. But still, none of it explained why the shooters fired so many bullets. None of it explained why they never checked who was in the car. Detectives Ramirez took notes, trying to connect names, locations, rivalries. The pieces didn't fit yet, but something told him they soon would. Violence like this didn't stay quiet. Someone always bragged, someone always slipped, and someone always talked.
Meanwhile, security camera footage started coming in from the gas station across the street, from the McDonald's drive-thru camera, from traffic poles. The detectives watched the car approach slowly. They watched the windows roll down. They watched the muzzle flashes. They watched the car speed away. But one detail stood out instantly. The car was unique. A bronze-colored Chevrolet Malibu. And on Chicago's west side, there weren't many cars like that. Detectives sent the footage to every patrol unit. Officers began scanning blocks, alleys, garages. They went door to door. They pulled plates. They questioned anyone who looked nervous. Meanwhile, word spread on the streets like wildfire. People whispered names. They whispered locations. They whispered who was bragging about the shooting. Someone even posted online, claiming they knew exactly who did it. Back at the hospital, a nurse approached John Tay softly. His body was numb. His mind was drowning. Hours felt like minutes. Minutes felt like days. The world outside kept moving, but he was stuck in the worst moment of his life. Detectives entered with careful steps. "Mr. Adams, we think we have a lead." His eyes lifted, dark, empty, trembling. But behind that pain stood something stronger, the need for justice. Detective Ramirez continued. "We found the car on a camera 2 blocks from the scene. We're tracking it now, and we believe the shooters may be connected to a retaliation dispute." A retaliation dispute. A feud he wasn't even part of. A war he didn't choose. A fight his daughter had no place in. The nurse squeezed his shoulder. He closed his eyes, swallowing the anger before it swallowed him. Hours later, the detectives got the break they needed. A patrol officer radioed in from a quiet residential street. We found a bronze Malibu parked behind an abandoned house. Windows shot out, bullet casings on the ground. Detective Ramirez and his team rushed over. The car was warm, recently driven. That meant the shooters were close. Maybe a few houses away. Maybe hiding. Maybe watching. They began searching the area. Backyards, garages, side doors. They knocked on houses with boarded windows. They asked neighbors if they saw anyone run. And finally, an old woman pointed to a house down the block. "They went in there," she whispered. "Hoodies. One had a bag. They were moving fast." Detectives surrounded the house. Guns drawn, voices sharp, hearts pounding. "Chicago police! Come out with your hands up!" Silence. Then footsteps. Then a window creaked. Someone was trying to escape. The detectives rushed to the side of the house just in time to see a figure crawling out of a back window. Hood pulled tight, backpack slung over his shoulder.
"Stop! Police!" But the figure didn't stop. He ran. Detective Ramirez took off after him, sprinting through weeds, ducking under low branches, pushing his legs harder than he had in years. The suspect jumped a fence. Ramirez followed. The suspect ran through an alley. Ramirez closed the gap. Just when it looked like the suspect might get away, he slipped, fell hard, and dropped the backpack. Inside that backpack would be the break that changed the entire case. Detective Ramirez didn't waste a second. He lunged forward, pinning the suspect to the ground as backup officers rushed into the alley. The young man struggled, kicking and cursing, but the weight of 3 officers forced him still. His hoodie slipped off his head, revealing a scared face, much younger than Ramirez expected. Maybe 18, maybe 19. But age didn't matter. Intent did. And this boy had run from a murder scene. While officers cuffed him, Ramirez grabbed the backpack lying on the ground. The zipper was half open from the fall, and inside, he saw exactly what he hoped and feared to find. A handgun, a loaded magazine, and a black sweatshirt with fresh gunpowder residue. The detective's heart pounded. This wasn't just evidence, it was the link they needed. The gun would be tested, the residue matched the crime, but most importantly, the suspect was now in custody, and young men talk, especially when they're scared. Back at the station, the suspect was placed in an interview room. He kept his eyes down, breathing hard, tapping his foot nervously. Detectives watched him from behind the one-way glass. They didn't rush, they didn't shout. They waited for the right moment, because they knew the truth was close. Finally, Ramirez stepped in. He dropped the backpack on the table. The metal of the handgun clinked against the wood. The suspect flinched. You know what that is. And you know what it's connected to. The suspect swallowed hard. His hand shook. For the first time since his arrest, he looked truly terrified. "We didn't mean to hit her. We were trying to scare her dad. That's it. We didn't see the girl, I swear." Ramirez leaned forward. "A little girl is dead. A 7-year-old. You think we didn't mean to fixes that?" The boy dropped his face into his hands. Tears slipped through his fingers, and slowly, the story came out. He told detectives the names of the other 2 shooters, where they lived, where they hid the second gun, even the car they dumped after the shooting. Every detail spilled out in a desperate attempt to save himself from the full weight of a murder charge. Within hours, officers were hitting doors across the west side. The other 2 suspects were captured, one trying to run out the back of a house, the other hiding inside a cousin's apartment. Guns were found, phones, clothing, messages that showed the plan. Everything detectives needed fell into place. By evening, Chicago police held a press conference. Cameras pointed forward, reporters leaned in. The city waited. "We have arrested all 3 offenders responsible for the fatal shooting of 7-year-old Jaslyn Adams. Justice is moving forward." People across the city cried, some in relief, some in anger, but all of them felt the same thing. This child mattered.
At the hospital, Jaslyn's family gathered in a quiet room. Flowers covered every surface, balloons, photos, cards from strangers. Her father stood beside the bed where she should have been laughing, talking, asking him to buy her candy from the vending machine.
A nurse approached him gently. "They caught them," she said softly. "All of them." For a long time, he didn't answer. He stared at a picture of Jaslyn taped to the wall, her smiling face, her bright eyes, her missing front tooth. Finally, he placed a hand over his heart. It still doesn't bring her back, but she deserves justice. Days later, a candlelight vigil formed outside the McDonald's. Hundreds showed up. Children held teddy bears. Adults held candles. Cars honked in support. The air felt heavy but warm, filled with love for a child most had never met. A preacher spoke. A choir sang softly. And as Jaslyn's family released pink balloons into the night sky, the crowd lifted their voices together. Her name is Jaslyn, and we will not forget her. The balloons floated higher and higher, drifting above the city lights, rising past the rooftops and over the quiet neighborhoods below. A symbol of a life stolen too soon, and a reminder of how fragile innocence can be on streets marked by violence. Detective Ramirez stood in the back of the crowd, hands in his pockets, watching the balloons disappear into the clouds. The case was closed. The killers were caught. But the weight of the tragedy stayed with him. Because this wasn't just another file. This wasn't just another crime. This was a little girl whose smile should have lasted decades longer. This was a father who would forever replay the sound of gunfire in his mind. This was a community pushed to its breaking point and determined to rise again. And as the last balloon vanished into the night, Ramirez whispered under his breath, "She should still be here." The wind carried the words away, but the message stayed. For Jaslyn, for every child lost too soon, and for a city still fighting to protect the innocence it has left.